Dearest listeners, there exists in this world no greater folly than a heart that believes itself beyond redemption, nor any greater tragedy than love that dares not speak its name for fear of loss. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of two souls bound by circumstance yet divided by ghosts. She, sold like chattel to preserve her family's honor, and he, a duke so wounded by grief that he mistook numbness for wisdom. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the deepest convictions, must be unfolded slowly to reveal their true spirit. In the autumn of 1814, when Napoleon's exile had brought an uneasy peace to England's shores, the drawing rooms of Mayfair whispered with particular venom about the spectacular fall of the Earl of Westmere. Lord Reginald Fairmont, once the toast of whites and a favorite at Carlton House, had managed in the span of 18 months to lose not merely his fortune at the gaming tables, but very nearly his ancient title itself. The whispers grew more pointed still when it became known that salvation had come in the most peculiar form. A marriage contract signed in the dead of night with Adrian Blackmore, 5th Duke of Greystone, a man whose own tragedy had rendered him as remote from society as a hermit in his cave. Lady Helena Fairmont had learned of her fate on a Tuesday morning in October, when the leaves outside the window of her apartments at Westmere Park hung like copper coins against the gray sky. Her father had summoned her to his study with all the solemnity of a funeral march, and there, surrounded by the portraits of ancestors whose honor she was now meant to preserve, she had listened in perfect silence as he explained the terms of her purchase. For purchase it was, though wrapped in the prettier language of matrimonial contract. 22 years of life had taught Helena that women of her station possessed little more agency than the thoroughbreds in the stable, bred for specific purposes and traded according to their bloodlines. Yet she had harbored, in the secret chambers of her heart, some small hope that affection might one day guide her choice of husband. Her mother, the late Countess, had enjoyed a love match with her father before gaming, and drink had soured his character, and Helena had grown to womanhood, believing such happiness might be her portion as well. The settlement papers lay spread across her father's mahogany desk like a battle plan, each clause carefully negotiated by solicitors who had never met the woman whose future they were bartering. £60,000, a staggering sum that would settle every debt and restore the Fairmont name to respectability. In exchange, one daughter, gently bred and unspoiled, to be delivered forthwith to Greystone Abbey in Derbyshire, there to assume the duties of Duchess to a man she had never met. Helena had heard the stories naturally. All of London knew of Adrian Blackmore's tragedy, how his beloved first wife Catherine had died in childbed 3 years past, taking with her their son and heir. Society had watched with fascination as the young Duke, once known for his easy charm and generous nature, had withdrawn from all company, transforming Greystone Abbey into something approaching a fortress. No balls, no house parties, no season in London. He had become, in the estimation of the ton, quite thoroughly unmarriageable, which made his sudden interest in acquiring a wife all the more mysterious. The betrothal announcement appeared in the Morning Post on a Wednesday, and by Thursday afternoon, the drawing rooms of Mayfair fairly buzzed with speculation. Lady Jersey, that most formidable of Almack's patronesses, was heard to declare it the most shocking misalliance she had witnessed in 40 years of observing society's follies. Others, more charitable in their assessment, suggested that grief had finally driven the Duke to seek companionship, though few believed affection played any role in the arrangement. Helena herself maintained a disciplined detachment from the furore surrounding her engagement. She found the drama surrounding her a peculiar relief, for while others obsessed over her fate, she focused only on the precise folding of a lace ruffle, a small, controllable task in a life that had suddenly become vast and terrifyingly uncertain. She spent her final weeks at Westmere Park walking the familiar paths of her childhood, memorizing the way morning light fell through the oak trees in the home wood, the precise scent of her mother's rose garden in its autumn decay. She had been raised to duty as other young ladies were raised to accomplishments, and if that duty now required her to marry a stranger, She would meet the challenge with the same quiet dignity that had seen her through every trial of her young life. Her trousseau, hastily assembled by the village seamstress with fabric purchased on credit, reflected the reduced circumstances of her family. Where other brides of her station might expect silk from Lyon and lace from Brussels, Helena made do with good English wool and Irish linen, each garment carefully chosen for durability rather than fashion. She had no lady's maid to accompany her to her new home. Such luxuries were beyond their current means, and so she carefully folded each gown herself, placing them in the worn leather trunk that had once belonged to her grandmother. The night before her departure, Helena sat by her bedchamber window and composed a letter to her deceased mother, a habit she had maintained since childhood whenever facing moments of particular significance. She wrote of her fears, her hopes, and her determination to honor the family name regardless of what trials awaited her at Greystone Abbey. The letter, like all the others before it, she would burn in the morning, but the act of writing had always brought her comfort, as though her mother's spirit might somehow receive the words and offer guidance from beyond the veil. Sleep came fitfully that final night, punctuated by dreams of unfamiliar halls and faces she had never seen but somehow feared to disappoint. When dawn broke gray and cold over Westmere Park, Helena rose with the composure that would define her entry into matrimony. Not joyful, perhaps, but resolved to meet whatever fate awaited her with grace and dignity intact. She was, after all, a Fairmont, and centuries of noble blood ran in her veins, even if that blood had been sold to satisfy a gambling debt. The carriage that would carry her to her new life stood ready in the courtyard. Her father's own traveling coach pressed into service one final time before it too would be sold to satisfy his creditors. Helena took her leave of Westmere Park with dry eyes and a straight spine, a figure of perfect composure, carrying herself like the duchess she was about to become, even if the title felt utterly foreign. The journey to Greystone Abbey required 2 days of travel through countryside that grew progressively wilder as Helena's carriage departed the familiar lanes of her birth county for the rugged hills of Derbyshire. Autumn had painted the landscape in shades of amber and scarlet, and under different circumstances, Helena might have found beauty in the rolling moors and ancient stone walls that marked the boundaries of her new home. Instead, she found herself cataloging each mile that separated her from everything she had ever known, each turn of the wheels carrying her deeper into a future she could scarcely imagine. The abbey itself emerged from the morning mist, like something conjured from a Gothic romance, its gray stone walls rising from manicured parkland with a magnificence that quite took Helena's breath away. Greystone had been in the Blackmore family for 4 centuries, and each generation had added to its grandeur until it stood as one of the finest examples of English architecture in all the North Country. As her carriage wound up the curved drive lined with ancient oaks, Helena felt the full weight of her new responsibilities settle upon her shoulders like a mantle of lead. The household staff awaited her arrival in the grand entrance hall, assembled with military precision under the watchful eye of Mrs. Bramwell, the housekeeper whose starched propriety could have served as a pattern card for servants throughout England. Helena was presented to each member of the considerable staff, from the elderly butler Grimsby down to the youngest scullery maid, and she noted with approval that despite the Duke's reputation for reclusiveness, his household ran with clockwork efficiency. Yet it was what, or rather who, was conspicuously absent from this formal reception that struck Helena most forcefully. Adrian Blackmore, 5th Duke of Greystone, her husband-to-be, was nowhere to be seen. Mrs. Bramwell, with the diplomatic skill that marked her as a superior housekeeper, explained that His Grace had been called away on urgent estate business and would return in time for the wedding ceremony, scheduled for the following morning in the Abbey's private chapel. Helena was shown to the Duchess's apartments, rooms that had stood empty for 3 years since Catherine Blackmore's death, and found herself surrounded by the ghostly presence of her predecessor. The chambers were beautiful, certainly, decorated in shades of pale blue and cream that spoke of refined taste and unlimited resources. Yet they bore the peculiar stillness of rooms too long unoccupied, as though the very air had grown heavy with disuse. Helena's modest belongings, unpacked by a young housemaid named Mary, seemed to disappear entirely in the vast spaces, and she felt rather like an imposter playing at being duchess in apartments clearly meant for someone far grander than herself. It was while exploring these rooms in the fading afternoon light that Helena discovered the portrait. Catherine Blackmore gazed down from above the marble fireplace with the serene beauty of a Madonna, her dark hair arranged in classical curls, her deep blue eyes holding secrets that death had sealed forever. She had been, Helena noted with a curious pang, everything that she herself was not. Petite, where Helena was tall, dark where she was fair, sophisticated where Helena felt herself to be merely country-bred. The inscription on the gilded frame read simply, "Catherine, beloved wife and mother," and Helena found herself wondering if she would ever merit such tenderness from the man she was to marry on the morrow. The wedding dress awaiting her had also belonged to Catherine, a gesture of either remarkable sentiment or crushing practicality that Helena could not determine. The gown was exquisite, fashioned from ivory silk with Brussels lace and seed pearl embroidery that must have cost more than Helena's entire trousseau. Yet wearing her predecessor's wedding dress felt rather like inhabiting someone else's skin, and Helena spent a restless night wondering if she would spend her entire marriage living in Catherine's shadow. Dawn of her wedding day brought no relief from her apprehensions, only the bustling efficiency of servants determined to prepare her for a ceremony that felt more like a business transaction than a celebration of matrimony. Mary proved surprisingly skilled with paper and pins, and Helena's fair hair was arranged in soft ringlets that complemented Catherine's dress, though she could not shake the feeling that she was merely playing a role rather than beginning a new life. The chapel at Greystone Abbey was a jewel of medieval architecture, its ancient stones having witnessed 4 centuries of Blackmore marriages, christenings, and funerals. As Helena walked down the short aisle on the arm of her father, who had arrived that morning looking rather the worse for his recent troubles, she found her attention focused not on the magnificent stained glass windows or the elaborately carved altar, but on the tall figure waiting for her at the chancel rail. Adrian Blackmore was undeniably handsome, though his handsomeness bore the sharp edges of a man acquainted with sorrow. At 29, he possessed the bearing of a natural aristocrat, his dark hair touched with premature silver at the temples, his gray eyes holding depths that suggested both intelligence and pain. He stood with military straightness in his wedding clothes of dark blue superfine and silver brocade, every inch the Duke, yet Helena sensed immediately that he was as reluctant a participant in this ceremony as she. The wedding service proceeded with Anglican efficiency, each word of the ancient ceremony carrying weight that seemed almost tangible in the sacred space. As she spoke her vows, Helena noticed the scent of old wax and dust from the altar cloth. When the rector asked for her pledge, her voice, though quiet, was perfectly steady. Yet in the subsequent silence, she heard the audible intake of Adrian's breath, a fleeting vulnerability that belied his granite composure. Helena found herself studying her bridegroom's profile as they made their vows, noting the firm line of his jaw, the way his hands remained perfectly steady as he placed his mother's wedding ring upon her finger, the complete absence of warmth in his gray eyes when they briefly met her own. When the rector pronounced them man and wife, Adrian's kiss upon her cheek was as perfunctory as a business seal upon a contract. Helena registered the contact as merely a pressure, a cold formality, and observed the wedding party through a strange, glassed-in sense of unreality, as though she watched someone else's wedding from a great distance. The handful of witnesses, mostly household staff and local clergy, offered their congratulations with genuine warmth, yet Helena could not escape the impression that she had just participated in an elaborate charade rather than the most important ceremony of her life. The wedding breakfast that followed was equally surreal. Helena sat at the head of the long dining table in the state dining room, presiding over a meal that would have fed a small village, while her new husband maintained conversation with mechanical politeness. He inquired about her journey, expressed hope that her apartments were suitable, and mentioned that he would be departing again in the afternoon for pressing business in Manchester, leaving her to settle into her new role without the encumbrance of his presence. As the golden afternoon light slanted through the mullioned windows, Helena found herself alone in her magnificent prison, married to a man who had made it abundantly clear that their union was purely one of convenience. She stood before Catherine's portrait once again, studying those serene features with new understanding. Whatever love had existed in these rooms had died with the first Duchess, and Helena was merely the keeper of an empty title in a house haunted by memories she could never share. The weight of her isolation pressed upon her like a physical thing, and for the first time since learning of her fate, Helena allowed herself the luxury of tears. They fell silently onto Catherine's wedding dress, marking her acceptance of a truth she had not fully grasped until this moment. She had been purchased not as a wife, but as a caretaker of a legacy that would never truly be her own. The first month of Helena's marriage passed in a peculiar state of suspended animation, as though the very walls of Greystone Abbey had absorbed her presence without truly acknowledging it. Adrian proved to be a most elusive husband, departing each morning for various estate business and returning well past the dinner hour when Helena had already retired to her solitary meal in the morning room. They encountered each other primarily at breakfast, where conversation was limited to discussions of weather and household matters, delivered with the sort of impersonal courtesy one might show to a well-bred guest who had rather overstayed their welcome. Helena quickly established routines that would provide structure to her days while avoiding the painful awareness of her husband's determined absence. She rose early for solitary walks in the extensive gardens, where the late autumn flowers provided some color in what increasingly felt like a gray world. The head gardener, an elderly Scotsman named MacLeod, proved surprisingly willing to engage in conversation about botanical matters, and Helena found unexpected pleasure in learning the Latin names of plants she had admired without knowing their proper designations. The library became her refuge during the long afternoon hours. Greystone's collection was extensive and eclectic, accumulated by generations of scholarly Blackmores who had possessed both the means and inclination to purchase first editions and rare manuscripts. Helena discovered travelogues that transported her to exotic locations she would never visit, philosophical treatises that challenged her understanding of the world, and novels that provided temporary escape from the uncomfortable realities of her situation. It was in the library that she first encountered tangible evidence of the man her husband had been before grief transformed him. A volume of Byron's poetry bore marginalia in Adrian's elegant script, observations that revealed a romantic sensibility at odds with his current coldness. Shakespeare's sonnets were extensively annotated with comments that suggested deep familiarity with matters of the heart, and Helena found herself wondering what manner of man could have written such perceptive notes about love while maintaining such rigid emotional distance from his own wife. The household staff treated her with respectful deference, yet Helena sensed their uncertainty about her role in a house where the master appeared determined to pretend she did not exist. Mrs. Bramwell provided daily reports on domestic matters with the efficiency of a military adjutant, but Helena detected subtle signs that the housekeeper found the current arrangement as peculiar as Helena herself did. Meals were served with exacting precision, her chambers maintained in perfect order, her every comfort anticipated. Yet she felt rather like an expensive ornament being carefully preserved in a museum. Helena's greatest challenge during these early weeks was learning to navigate the complex social obligations that accompanied her new rank. As Duchess of Greystone, she was expected to receive callers, participate in local charitable endeavors, and maintain correspondence with other ladies of her station throughout the county. Yet without her husband's presence to legitimize her position, these duties felt hollow and performative. Lady Pembroke, wife of the local magistrate, proved to be the most persistent of her early callers, arriving each Tuesday afternoon for precisely 30 minutes of conversation that felt more like an interrogation disguised as politeness. Her questions about the Duke's health, his business affairs, and the likelihood of an heir being produced in timely fashion were delivered with the sort of relentless cheerfulness that made evasion nearly impossible. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Thornfield, proved more genuinely kind in her overtures, inviting Helena to participate in the parish's charitable works and offering to introduce her to other young wives in the district. Yet Helena found herself hesitating to accept these invitations, uncertain whether her husband would approve of such connections, and reluctant to explain why she could not speak with authority about his preferences in such matters. It was during her 3rd week at Greystone that Helena first witnessed Adrian in an unguarded moment. She had been returning from her morning walk through the rose garden when she glimpsed him through the windows of his study, bent over what appeared to be correspondence. His shoulders carried a burden of weariness that his public demeanor never revealed, and his face wore an expression of such profound melancholy that Helena felt her heart contract with unexpected sympathy. For several moments she stood frozen on the gravel path, studying this private version of the man she had married. Without the mask of ducal composure, Adrian looked younger and infinitely more vulnerable, and Helena found herself wondering what thoughts occupied him during the long hours he spent sequestered in that book-lined sanctuary. When he suddenly lifted his head and their eyes met through the glass, both started like adversaries whose swords had unexpectedly crossed. Helena hurried past without acknowledgement, but the image of his unguarded face lingered in her mind throughout the day. Their first genuine conversation, if such it could be called, occurred entirely by accident. Helena had been in the library during what she believed to be Adrian's usual absence when he entered unexpectedly, clearly seeking some specific volume. The startlement on his face upon finding her ensconced in his favorite reading chair with a book of Italian sonnets was almost comical, and for a moment they stared at each other in mutual embarrassment. Adrian recovered his composure first, inquiring with stiff formality whether the book she held was to her liking and whether the library was providing adequate entertainment during her solitary hours. Helena replied that she found Petrarch's work profoundly moving, though she admitted her Italian was insufficient to appreciate the full beauty of the original language. This observation appeared to surprise Adrian, who had perhaps not expected his purchased wife to possess any familiarity with classical literature. The conversation that followed was brief, but revealed glimmers of the intellectual compatibility that might exist between them under different circumstances. Adrian's knowledge of Italian poetry proved extensive, and as he spoke, recommending translations, Helena saw a brief, unguarded flash of passion in his gray eyes, a depth of feeling that made his current coldness seem like a deliberate self-mutilation. For perhaps 10 minutes, they spoke like two civilized people sharing a common interest, until Adrian seemed to catch himself in the act of human warmth and retreated behind his customary coldness. Helena began to notice subtle changes in Adrian's behavior following this encounter. He took greater care to avoid the library during hours when she might be present, yet she sometimes discovered books left precisely where she would find them. Volumes that corresponded exactly to subjects they had discussed or themes that had captured her interest. She never acknowledged these silent gifts directly, but she began leaving her own recommendations in return, careful annotations in volumes she had particularly enjoyed that might provide insights into her own character and interests. This odd form of communication through literature became the closest thing to intimacy in their peculiar marriage. Helena would discover that Adrian had read her recommendations by finding his own marginalia added to her comments, creating strange conversations conducted entirely in the margins of books. Their observations ranged from literary criticism to philosophy, to occasional glimpses of personal opinion that felt almost shockingly intimate given their usual formality. Yet even as these small connections developed, Adrian seemed to recognize them as dangerous departures from his intended course and would inevitably retreat further into coldness. Following any moment of apparent warmth or shared understanding, he would absent himself from Greystone entirely for several days, returning with renewed determination to maintain the emotional distance that clearly served as his protection against involvement. Helena found herself caught between hope and despair as November gave way to December and her marriage settled into its strange pattern of avoidance and longing. She had not expected love. Such romantic notions had no place in arrangements like theirs. But she had hoped for companionship, perhaps even friendship with the man whose name she now bore. Instead, she found herself living parallel to a husband who seemed determined to ensure their paths never truly crossed, sharing a house with a ghost who happened to still draw breath. The approach of Christmas brought additional complications in the form of invitations and social obligations that would require Adrian's presence as her escort. Helena studied each elegant card with growing anxiety, wondering whether her husband would consent to appear publicly with his unwanted wife, or whether she would be forced to decline all social engagements, further cementing her reputation as the Duchess whom nobody ever saw in company with her Duke. The winter of 1814 arrived early at Greystone Abbey, blanketing the estate in snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something altogether more magical and austere. Helena found unexpected pleasure in the dramatic change of seasons, discovering that the ancient building possessed a particular beauty when viewed through frost-etched windows, its gray stones softened by the white mantle that covered garden and moor alike. It was during this season of enforced intimacy, for the heavy snows made travel difficult and kept both Duke and Duchess within the abbey's walls for longer periods, that Helena began to observe her husband with the careful attention of a naturalist studying a particularly elusive species. Adrian's patterns became more predictable in winter's grip. His morning rides through the estate regardless of weather, his afternoon hours in the estate office reviewing tenant concerns, his evening retreat to the study where lamplight would burn well into the night. The revelation of Adrian's true character came through the most mundane of circumstances. Helena had been returning from the orangery, where she had taken to spending time among the citrus trees that provided both warmth and the illusion of summer during the bleakest months, when she encountered a scene that stopped her in her tracks. Through the partially open door of Adrian's study, she observed him in earnest conversation with Tom Fletcher, one of the estate's tenant farmers whose cottage had been damaged in a recent storm. The Adrian she witnessed in that moment bore little resemblance to the coldly polite stranger who shared her breakfast table. His attention to Fletcher's concerns was complete and genuine, his questions practical and informed, his manner that of a man who understood intimately the challenges faced by those dependent upon his land for their livelihood. When Fletcher mentioned his wife's recent illness and the expense of medicines, Adrian immediately arranged for Dr. Morrison to attend her without charge, and Helena observed him instructing his steward immediately to provide the necessary funds for medicines and for the family's provisions during Fletcher's recovery period. This glimpse behind the facade of indifference intrigued Helena sufficiently that she began paying closer attention to Adrian's interactions with others. She discovered that while he might maintain rigid emotional distance from his wife, he was deeply beloved by his tenants and servants, all of whom regarded him as the finest master Greystone had known in generations. His reputation for fairness in disputes, generosity in times of hardship, and genuine concern for the welfare of all those under his protection stood in stark contrast to the cold indifference he showed toward her. The mystery of this contradiction consumed Helena's thoughts as December progressed toward Christmas. If Adrian was capable of such warmth and consideration toward his dependents, what particular quality did she possess that rendered her uniquely unworthy of his regard? Was it simply that she represented an unwanted complication in a life he had arranged to his satisfaction? Or was there something more specific about her person or circumstances that inspired his aversion? The answer came in fragments, revealed through overheard conversations and careful observation of Adrian's behavior in moments when he believed himself unobserved. Helena began to understand that her husband's coldness was not born of indifference, but of active resistance. He was not incapable of caring for her, but rather terrified of the consequences should he allow such feelings to develop. The truth revealed itself most clearly during a conversation Helena inadvertently overheard between Adrian and Dr. Morrison, the elderly physician who had attended the Blackmore family for decades. The doctor had come to dine on a particularly bitter evening in December, and Helena, descending the stairs to retrieve a book she had left in the morning room, paused when she heard her name mentioned in their discussion. Dr. Morrison was expressing concern about Helena's obvious unhappiness and suggesting that Adrian might consider making some effort to include his wife in his daily routine. Adrian's response, delivered with a vehemence that startled Helena with its intensity, revealed the depth of his internal struggle. He spoke of Catherine's death with such raw pain that Helena felt like an intruder merely overhearing it, describing how love had nearly destroyed him when it was torn away, how the thought of caring for another person with such intensity was beyond his current emotional capacity. The physician's gentle counsel that hiding from love would not protect Adrian from loss, but would certainly guarantee him loneliness, fell upon ears that seemed determined not to hear. Adrian maintained that his arrangement with Helena was perfect precisely because it demanded nothing of his heart. She would bear his name and provide him with heirs, but he would never again risk the devastation that had nearly killed him when Catherine died. Helena retreated to her chambers with this knowledge burning in her chest like swallowed flame. The understanding that Adrian's coldness was born not of indifference but of terror provided little comfort, for how could she compete with the ghost of a perfect love that had ended in tragedy? Yet it also offered the first genuine insight into her husband's character that she had possessed since arriving at Greystone, and with understanding came the possibility of patience. The Christmas season brought its own challenges and unexpected opportunities. Traditional celebrations at Greystone included an elaborate feast for all estate workers and their families, a custom that required both Duke and Duchess to appear together in public for the first time since their wedding. Helena approached the occasion with considerable anxiety, uncertain how to present herself as mistress of the celebration, when she felt more like a stranger observing someone else's traditions. Adrian's behavior during the Christmas festivities revealed yet another facet of his complex character. As host to his people, he was charming, gracious, and thoroughly engaging, the man he might have been under different circumstances. Helena watched him dance with tenant farmers' daughters, listen gravely to elderly workers' concerns, and ensure that every child present received gifts appropriate to their station. He was, she realized, beloved precisely because he had never forgotten that privilege carried responsibility, that the comfort of the great house was built upon the labor of many hands. When protocol required Adrian to partner Helena for the traditional Christmas dance, she found herself in his arms for the first time since their wedding. The complicated figures of the ancient dance brought them together and apart in patterns that seemed to mirror their entire relationship. Moments of proximity, followed by deliberate separation, brief glimpses of connection before retreat into formality. Yet Helena could not ignore the way Adrian's hand trembled slightly when it touched hers, or the manner in which he seemed to forget his reserve when the dance required him to guide her through particularly complex movements. For the duration of that single dance, they moved together with surprising harmony, and Helena caught glimpses of the man he might have been. The man he had been, perhaps, before grief taught him that loving meant losing. The evening concluded with the traditional wassailing in the orchard, where the assembled company sang ancient songs to ensure the apple tree's fertility in the coming year. Standing beside Adrian in the torchlit darkness, surrounded by voices raised in celebration of hope and renewal, Helena felt for the first time since her arrival at Greystone a sense of belonging to something larger than her own unhappiness. When Adrian offered her his arm for the walk back to the house, she accepted with newfound understanding of the battle being fought behind his gray eyes. He was not her enemy, she realized, but rather a fellow combatant, a prisoner caught by circumstances that had brought them together while keeping them fundamentally apart. The knowledge brought little comfort, but it provided the foundation for something that might, in time, grow into the patience required to wait for walls built of grief to crumble of their own accord. As the year drew to its close, Helena made a private resolution that would guide her conduct in the months to come. She would not attempt to storm the fortress of Adrian's heart, for such direct assault would only strengthen his defenses. Instead, she would simply be present, consistent, patient, and understanding, allowing him to discover gradually that loving need not inevitably lead to losing, that the human heart possessed sufficient strength to risk caring once again. The new year of 1815 arrived at Greystone Abbey with a particularly fierce winter storm that isolated the estate from the surrounding countryside for nearly a week. Helena found unexpected pleasure in this enforced solitude, for it meant Adrian could not escape to his usual business concerns, and was thus compelled to spend time in her general vicinity, even if he continued to maintain careful emotional distance. The shared experience of being snowbound seemed to soften some of his more rigid formality, and Helena began to hope that progress might be possible in their peculiar matrimonial arrangement. It was during this period of cautious optimism that events conspired to create the most devastating misunderstanding of Helena's young marriage. The trouble began with the arrival of a letter that managed to reach Greystone despite the treacherous conditions, delivered by a postwriter whose dedication to his duties bordered on the heroic. The correspondence bore the distinctive seal of the Earl of Westmere, Helena's father, and was addressed to the Duke of Greystone with the sort of urgent formality that suggested matters of considerable importance. Helena observed Adrian reading this letter during breakfast, noting how his expression shifted from mild interest to something approaching shock. Then his expression snapped into the cold mask she had learned to recognize as his defensive response to emotional disturbance. He excused himself immediately upon finishing the correspondence, leaving his meal untouched and his coffee growing cold in its cup, and did not emerge from his study for the remainder of the day. The mysterious letter's contents remained unknown to Helena, but its effects upon Adrian were impossible to ignore. He became even more distant than usual, speaking to her only when absolutely necessary, and then with a formality that seemed almost hostile in its rigidity. His previous pattern of leaving subtle book recommendations for her in the library ceased entirely, and Helena found herself truly alone at Greystone for the first time since discovering their strange literary correspondence. The truth behind Adrian's altered behavior emerged through the worst possible means: a conversation Helena overheard between Adrian and his solicitor, Mr. Hartwell, who had braved the dangerous roads to reach Greystone in response to an urgent summons. The two men were discussing the terms of Helena's marriage settlement when she passed by the partially open door of Adrian's study, and the words she heard stopped her dead in her tracks with their devastating implications. Her father, it seemed, had written to request additional funds beyond the original settlement, claiming unexpected debts that threatened the family's remaining holdings. Adrian's response to this demand revealed the extent of his contempt for what he saw as a transparent attempt at extortion. His comments about Helena's family, delivered with cutting precision to his legal advisor, left no doubt about his view of the transaction that had brought about their marriage. Helena heard herself described as merchandise that had failed to meet expectations. A purchase that had seemed reasonable at the time, but now appeared overpriced given the continuing financial demands from her family. Adrian spoke of feeling deceived by her father's representations, suggesting that the Earl of Westmere had deliberately misrepresented both Helena's circumstances and her likely behavior as Duchess. The conversation concluded with Adrian instructing his solicitor to refuse any additional payments while making it clear that he considered the Fairmont family to be nothing more than accomplished swindlers who had taken advantage of his grief-stricken state to extract an unconscionable sum for damaged goods. The shock of hearing herself discussed in such terms rendered Helena momentarily immobile, and by the time she managed to retreat to her chambers, the full implications of what she had learned had crystallized into devastating clarity. Adrian had not merely married her as a matter of convenience, he actively resented her presence and viewed her as part of an ongoing deception perpetrated by her family. Every moment of seeming warmth, every shared literary discovery, every brief glimpse of connection had been false on his part. The automatic courtesy of a gentleman too well bred to reveal his true feelings about the burden he had been tricked into assuming. The knowledge that her father had apparently attempted to extract additional funds from Adrian added humiliation to Helena's pain. She had entered marriage believing herself to be fulfilling a legitimate arrangement that, while loveless, at least possessed the dignity of honesty on both sides. To learn that her family was viewed as perpetrating ongoing fraud upon her husband transformed her from an innocent victim of circumstances into an unwitting accomplice in deception. Helena's immediate response to this revelation was a fierce determination to remove herself from a situation that had become intolerable. She would not remain at Greystone as an object of her husband's contempt, living on charity extracted through what he clearly viewed as duplicity. Her pride, the one possession that remained truly her own, would not permit such degradation to continue. Yet practical considerations made immediate departure impossible. The winter storms that had isolated Greystone from the outside world also trapped Helena within its walls, at least until the roads became passable once again. She was forced to continue sharing meals with Adrian, maintaining the pretense of civilized behavior, while knowing that he viewed every mouthful she consumed as theft from his purse, every service rendered by his servants as charity extended to an unworthy recipient. The strain of maintaining composure under such circumstances proved almost unbearable. Helena found herself starting at unexpected sounds, interpreting every glance from household staff as evidence that they too understood her true position in the house. The walls of Greystone, which had begun to feel like home during the Christmas season, now seemed to close around her like a prison, and she counted each day until the weather might permit her escape. Adrian, meanwhile, appeared to interpret Helena's obvious distress as confirmation of her complicity in her family's financial manipulations. His behavior toward her became openly cold, stripped of even the basic courtesies he had previously maintained. The empty chair opposite her at the breakfast table, the clatter of his departure from the house before her own rising, these were the new rituals of their separation, making it clear through every gesture that her company had become actively unwelcome. The final straw came when Helena overheard Mrs. Bramwell explaining to a housemaid that His Grace had given instructions for the Duchess's correspondence to be monitored, apparently concerned that she might be communicating secretly with her family about financial matters. The realization that Adrian suspected her of actively plotting against his interests while accepting his hospitality proved beyond Helena's capacity for endurance. That night, alone in Catherine's rooms among Catherine's possessions, Helena made her plans for departure. She would wait until the roads cleared sufficiently to make travel possible, then leave Greystone with nothing more than the simple clothes she had brought from Westmere Park. The elaborate trousseau Adrian had provided, Catherine's jewelry that had been given to her as Duchess, even the wedding ring that had been his mother's, all would remain behind as evidence that she sought nothing from him beyond her freedom. The letter she composed that evening, to be left on her dressing table when she departed, was perhaps the most difficult document Helena had ever written. In it, she attempted to explain her actions without revealing that she had overheard his private conversations, accepting full responsibility for her family's behavior while making it clear that she had been as deceived by them as he. She asked for nothing, not forgiveness, not understanding, certainly not his regard, only that he remember her as someone who had tried, however inadequately, to uphold the dignity of a contract he saw as fraudulent. As February arrived with the promise of milder weather, Helena prepared for a departure that would mark the end of her brief tenure as Duchess of Greystone, and the beginning of an uncertain future in which her only companions would be her wounded pride, and the bitter knowledge that even marriages built on purely practical foundations could not survive when trust was absent from both sides. The first break in the winter weather came in mid-February, when the fierce grip of ice and snow that had held Greystone Abbey in isolation for weeks finally began to loosen. Helena watched the thaw from her chamber window with the keen attention of a prisoner observing the gradual weakening of her cell walls. Each day brought clearer roads and thus brought closer the moment when she could execute her escape from a marriage that had become unbearable. Her preparations were conducted with the methodical precision of a military campaign. Helena carefully sorted through her possessions, separating the few items that had belonged to her before marriage from the extensive wardrobe and jewelry that Adrian had provided. She would take nothing that could be construed as his property, nothing that might later be used as evidence of mercenary motives. The simple traveling dress of dark blue wool that she had worn on her arrival at Greystone would serve for her departure, along with the worn leather trunk that had been her grandmother's and the handful of books that represented her only true treasures. The most difficult aspect of her preparations involved securing transportation without alerting the household staff to her intentions. Helena realized she would be forced to rely upon the charity of strangers, for though her pin money remained unspent, she could not risk attempting to hire a coachman without alerting the household staff to her intentions. Salvation came from an unexpected source. Mary, the young housemaid who had tended Helena since her arrival, approached her with surprising boldness during the third week of February. The girl had observed Helena's obvious distress, and, with the intuitive understanding that sometimes exists between women of different stations united by common vulnerability, offered assistance that Helena had not dared to request. Mary's brother drove the mail coach that connected the surrounding villages to the larger towns, and she could arrange for Helena to travel as far as Manchester without payment, understanding that the Duchess's circumstances had become somehow desperate. The girl asked no questions about Helena's motivations, displaying a tact that spoke well of her character and her genuine affection for the mistress she had served with such loyal dedication. The plan they devised was necessarily simple. On the following Monday morning, when Adrian was scheduled to meet with his estate manager regarding spring planting schedules, Helena would walk to the village under the pretense of visiting the parish church. Mary's brother would collect her at the appointed time, and by evening Helena would be in Manchester, where she hoped to secure employment as a governess or companion, positions for which her education and breeding qualified her, even if her lack of references would make the search challenging. Yet as the appointed day approached, Helena found herself increasingly tormented by doubts about the course she had chosen. Her rational mind insisted that departure was the only honorable response to her impossible situation, yet her heart whispered treacherous questions about whether she might be misinterpreting Adrian's behavior, whether her pride was leading her to abandon a marriage that might yet be salvaged through patience and understanding. These doubts crystallized into agonizing uncertainty on the Sunday evening before her planned departure. Unable to sleep, Helena found herself walking the silent corridors of Greystone Abbey, perhaps for the last time, trying to memorize details of a place that had never truly been her home, but had somehow claimed a portion of her heart despite everything. It was during this melancholy pilgrimage that she encountered the most devastating revelation of her married life. A light burning in the estate office drew her attention, and through the partially open door, she glimpsed Adrian seated at his desk, surrounded by papers that bore the familiar red wax seal of her father's correspondence. But these were not the letters she had assumed. As she drew closer, driven by curiosity stronger than prudence, she discovered that Adrian was examining not demands for additional payment, but rather detailed financial records documenting every aspect of her maintenance at Greystone. The papers spread before him itemized expenses with meticulous precision: the cost of her food, her clothing, even the coal burned in her fireplace and the candles that lit her chamber. But rather than calculating these amounts as unwelcome burdens, Adrian was studying them with the focused attention of a man seeking to ensure that every possible comfort had been provided. Notes in his handwriting suggested adjustments to increase her allowances, authorization for purchases she had never requested, provisions for luxuries she had never even imagined desiring. The truth struck Helena with devastating force. Adrian had been monitoring her circumstances not from suspicion of fraud, but from concern for her welfare. Every conversation she had overheard and interpreted as evidence of his resentment had been misunderstood, filtered through her own insecurities and her assumption that she could only be viewed as an unwelcome obligation. The man she had thought despised her presence had actually been consumed with ensuring her comfort and happiness, even as he maintained the emotional distance he believed necessary for his own survival. Further papers revealed the full extent of Adrian's consideration for her welfare. He had established a substantial settlement in her name that would provide for her comfort should anything happen to him, arranged for her to receive income independent of his direct control, and even made provisions for her family's continued well-being that went far beyond the original marriage contract. The letters from her father that she had assumed were demands for additional funds were actually expressions of gratitude for Adrian's extraordinary generosity in supporting Westmere Park's restoration. The realization that she had been preparing to abandon a husband whose every action had been motivated by consideration for her welfare, even as he struggled with his own emotional limitations, filled Helena with shame so profound that she could barely remain standing. Her pride, which had seemed such a noble motivation for departure, now revealed itself as nothing more than wounded vanity that had prevented her from seeing the truth about Adrian's character. But perhaps the most devastating discovery came in the form of a letter Adrian had apparently been composing, its unfinished state suggesting the difficulty he experienced in expressing emotions he had trained himself to suppress. The partial document was addressed to Helena herself, and its fragmentary contents revealed a man tortured by his inability to offer her the warmth she deserved, conscious of her unhappiness, yet paralyzed by fear of the vulnerability that genuine caring would require. Adrian wrote of watching her from a distance, of admiring her grace under impossible circumstances, of recognizing in her the strength and dignity that Catherine had possessed, but expressed in a manner entirely Helena's own. He acknowledged his failure as a husband, while accepting full responsibility for the loneliness that marked her daily existence at Greystone. Most painfully, he expressed his belief that Helena would be happier elsewhere, with a man capable of offering her the affection that circumstances had made impossible for him to provide. The incomplete letter concluded with what appeared to be the beginning of arrangements for their marriage to be dissolved, should Helena express such a desire. Adrian had been preparing to offer her freedom, not from coldness or indifference, but from the recognition that his own emotional limitations were denying her the happiness she deserved. His coldness, she now understood, had been born not of contempt, but of guilt. The anguish of a man who knew himself to be failing someone he had grown to care for more deeply than was safe for his carefully guarded heart. Helena clutched the edge of the desk, feeling a profound physical disorientation. The truth of his kindness, his sacrifice, was a weight that made her knees weak, revealing her own pride not as dignity, but as a devastating, blind cruelty. Helena sank into the chair beside Adrian's desk, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her misunderstanding and the implications of what she had discovered. Here was a man who had spent months agonizing over her welfare, while she had assumed he viewed her with indifference, who had been planning to sacrifice his own desires for her happiness, while she had been plotting an escape that would have confirmed all his fears about his unworthiness as a husband. The sound of footsteps in the corridor alerted Helena to the necessity of retreat, but she carried with her knowledge that changed everything she had believed about her marriage and her husband. Adrian was not the cold, unfeeling man she had imagined, but rather someone so wounded by loss that he had convinced himself emotional distance was kindness, that withholding his heart was protection rather than cruelty. As dawn approached and her planned departure drew near, Helena found herself facing a choice that would determine not only her own future, but Adrian's understanding of his capacity for happiness. She could proceed with her escape, confirming his belief that he was incapable of making any woman content, or she could remain and fight for a marriage that might yet become something beautiful if both parties could find the courage to risk their carefully guarded hearts. Standing in her chamber as morning light crept through the frost-etched windows, Helena made the decision that would change everything. She would stay, not as the purchased wife accepting her fate, but as a woman choosing to fight for love with a man who had forgotten he was worthy of such devotion. The morning of Helena's planned departure dawned clear and bright, with sunlight streaming through her chamber windows to illuminate the packed trunk that had represented her escape from an unbearable situation. Yet everything had changed with the revelations of the previous night, and Helena found herself standing before her traveling dress with the knowledge that fleeing Greystone would represent not liberation, but the ultimate act of cowardice. She had misjudged Adrian completely, viewing his careful distance as indifference when it had actually been protection, not for himself alone, but for her as well. A man who believed himself incapable of love had been trying to shield her from what he saw as his own inadequacies, while she had interpreted his considerate arrangements for her welfare as evidence of contempt. The magnitude of their mutual misunderstanding was almost comical in its scope, yet the consequences would be tragic if not swiftly addressed. Helena's first decision was to send word to Mary that her services would not be required after all, a message that the loyal maid received with obvious relief and knowing smiles. The second was to unpack her meager belongings, returning her chamber to its usual state as though the planned escape had been nothing more than a fevered dream. Yet these were merely practical matters. The real challenge lay in determining how to approach Adrian with the truth about what she had discovered without revealing the full extent of her inadvertent espionage. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Adrian had apparently slept poorly, for he appeared at breakfast looking haggard and distracted, picking at his food with the mechanical movements of a man whose mind was entirely elsewhere. Helena studied his profile as he stared unseeing through the morning room windows, noting the tension in his shoulders and the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. When Adrian rose to leave without finishing his meal, Helena made her move with the decisiveness of a general committing to battle. She addressed him directly for the first time in weeks, her voice carefully modulated to convey neither accusation nor pleading, but simple, devastating honesty. Helena began not with declarations of unhappiness, but with a quiet statement that stopped Adrian in his tracks. She knew about the financial arrangements he had made for her family, the careful monitoring of her welfare, the unfinished letter planning her freedom. She spoke of discovering his true character not through his words, which had been designed to maintain distance, but through his actions, which had revealed a man of extraordinary honor, even as he believed himself to be failing as a husband. The shock on Adrian's face was complete and unguarded, his gray eyes widening in a silent, raw accusation of her private knowledge. For long moments he stood frozen, his duke's composure shattering like fragile porcelain, clearly calculating how much she had discovered and what it might mean. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness that months of careful control had never betrayed. He asked not how she had learned these things, but whether her discovery had made her think better or worse of him, a question that revealed his deepest fear that even his acts of honor had been judged insufficient in the grand tally of her unhappiness. Helena's response was to detail, with precision that left no doubt about the extent of her knowledge, exactly what his care had meant to a woman who had assumed herself unwanted. She spoke of the books left for her discovery, the arrangements made for her comfort, the sacrifice he had been prepared to make in offering her freedom when he believed it was what she deserved. Most devastating of all, she confronted him with the truth he had been hiding even from himself, that his coldness had been born not of indifference, but of caring too much to risk the vulnerability that love required. Adrian's response revealed a man stripped of all pretense, forced to confront not only Helena's knowledge of his actions, but the motivations he had refused to examine. He spoke haltingly at first, then with increasing fluency as he acknowledged the truth of what she had observed. Yes, he had monitored her welfare obsessively, not from duty, but from growing concern for her happiness. Yes, he had been planning to offer her freedom, not because he wanted her gone, but because he had convinced himself that his emotional limitations made him unworthy of her patience. The conversation that followed lasted several hours and revealed the full scope of their mutual misunderstanding. Adrian confessed that his distance had been protection not just for himself, but for Helena, an attempt to shield her from what he saw as his own inadequacies as a husband. The loss of Catherine and their child had convinced him that loving deeply meant suffering beyond endurance when that love was taken away, and he had persuaded himself that maintaining emotional distance was an act of kindness to them both. Yet the most significant revelation came when Adrian described his growing admiration for Helena's grace under impossible circumstances. his recognition that she possessed qualities entirely her own that had nothing to do with comparison to Catherine. He spoke of watching her in the garden, of finding comfort in her presence in the library, even when they never spoke, of the way her quiet dignity had slowly begun to heal wounds he had thought permanently infected with grief. Helena found courage to confess her own developing feelings, not the desperate attachment of a lonely woman, but genuine affection for the man she had glimpsed beneath the careful mask of indifference. She had seen his kindness to his tenants, his consideration for his servants, his struggle to do what he believed was right, even when it caused him pain. The man who thought himself incapable of love had been demonstrating it daily through actions rather than words, care expressed through deeds rather than sentiment. The moment when understanding finally dawned between them was marked not by dramatic declarations, but by a silence that held more communication than all their previous conversations combined. Adrian looked at Helena as though seeing her clearly for the first time, while she recognized in his expression not the cold indifference she had imagined, but wonder at discovering that love had been growing quietly between them, despite every effort to prevent it. Adrian's confession that he had been planning to offer her freedom, believing it to be what she deserved, moved Helena to tears that she made no effort to hide. She spoke of her own plans for departure, her assumption that he viewed her as an unwelcome burden, her recognition that they had both been preparing to sacrifice their own desires for what they mistakenly believed to be the other's happiness. The absurdity of their situation, two people in love yet planning to separate from mistaken consideration for each other's welfare, struck them both simultaneously, and Helena found herself laughing through her tears, while Adrian's face broke into the first genuine smile she had witnessed since their wedding day. The sound of his laughter, rusty from disuse but unmistakably warm, seemed to fill the morning room with light that had nothing to do with sunshine streaming through windows. What followed was not the passionate embrace of Gothic romance, but something far more precious. The careful, tentative beginning of genuine intimacy between two people who had learned to trust each other with truths they had been afraid to speak aloud. Adrian's touch, when he finally reached for Helena's hand, carried all the reverence of a man who had thought himself beyond redemption, discovering that grace was still possible. The remainder of that day was spent in conversation that revealed the depth of compatibility that had been hidden beneath months of misunderstanding. They spoke of books and ideas, of hopes and fears, of the future they might build together now that the ghosts of the past had been acknowledged and released. Adrian showed Helena through rooms of greystone that had been closed since Catherine's death, spaces that could now be reclaimed for new memories rather than preserved as shrines to old ones. The transformation in their relationship was observed by the household staff with the satisfaction of servants who had long hoped to see their master happy again. Mrs. Bramwell's smile became genuinely warm when she encountered the Duke and Duchess walking together in the morning, while Mary positively beamed with pride at having played some small role in preventing what would have been a devastating separation. Spring arrived early that year at Greystone Abbey, and with it came a renewal that encompassed more than the natural world. Helena found herself mistress of the house in reality rather than merely in name, working alongside Adrian to plan improvements that would benefit both family and tenants. The library became their shared sanctuary once again, but now their literary discussions were conducted face-to-face rather than through marginalia, their voices joining in harmony rather than speaking in solitary silence. The love that blossomed between them was different from the passion Adrian had shared with Catherine, forged by maturity and seasoned by the understanding that happiness was precious precisely because it was fragile. It was a love forged by mutual vulnerability, for they had both learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to risk everything while knowing that loss remained possible. By summer, Helena was expecting their first child, a development that brought joy, tempered by the inevitable fears that such news must evoke in a man who had lost his first heir. Yet, Adrian's response revealed how completely he had been transformed by allowing love back into his life. He was anxious, certainly, but no longer paralyzed by terror of loss. The prospect of fatherhood brought out his protective instincts while strengthening his determination to embrace fully whatever time they might be granted together. At Greystone Abbey, where ancient stones had witnessed centuries of human passion and pain, another generation learned the eternal truth. The fortress of the heart is built not against loss, but only against the possibility of joy.